Alexander's army begins its march in 334 BCE, crossing the Hellespont to invade Asia. It's a thrilling moment, full of anticipation and optimism. Macedonia's soldiers are pumped up, ready for glory and victory. With their armor gleaming and swords sharpened, they can already taste the triumphs to come. But wait, before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's not forget that even the mightiest conquerors need a snack once in a while. You probably won't survive this journey without one. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for the Macedonian army. Their first major stop was nothing short of monumental. They crossed the Hellespont into Asia, marking the beginning of Alexander's legendary military campaign. But among all the grandeur, how much time did they actually spend thinking about food? Historians still argue whether Alexander's primary focus was his conquest or whether he truly had an eye on how this journey would change cuisine forever. The soldiers, fresh from their triumphs in the Greek city-states, were marching across the Hellespont with a steady purpose. The Persian Empire loomed ahead, full of riches, resources, and new flavors. It was here that they would begin to encounter not just military challenges but culinary wonders that would, over time, shape their diet. Imagine a Macedonian soldier's surprise as he tasted his first bit of Persian lamb, seasoned with spices he had never known. Despite the ambition of the Macedonian army, they were still humans, hungry, tired, and more than capable of stopping for a quick snack. But even as they marched towards the heart of the Persian Empire, could Alexander's troops have been more concerned with the next meal than the next battle? As they marched on, historians suggest that food quickly became a primary concern. While the generals made plans for victory, soldiers wondered what they'd eat next. A quick bite, a fresh loaf of bread, maybe some dried fish, simple snacks that would sustain them through the grueling campaigns. Of course, they didn't have the luxury of modern snacks like protein bars, but they had their own ancient version of grab-and-go provisions. In this first section, we get the sense that, though Alexander was a strategic genius, his army's success might have been fueled by more than just battle tactics. Perhaps it was also the steady supply of meals and the morale boost of a good snack that helped them on their way. After the Macedonian army triumphantly crosses the Hellespont, they quickly dive into the heart of the Persian Empire. They're on a mission, of course, but let's be real, Alexander's troops are more than just battle-hardened warriors. They're also a group of hungry men on a long march through foreign lands, and it's time to think about more than just strategy. The Persian Empire offers a wealth of riches, and we're not just talking gold here. The real treasure? Food. Persian cuisine, with its lavish spices, intricate flavors, and exotic ingredients, provides a sharp contrast to the simple, meat and bread fare the Macedonian soldiers are used to. Historians still argue whether the exposure to these rich flavors significantly altered the soldiers' palates or if they were too preoccupied with war to care. But one thing's for sure, if you've ever tasted Persian rice or lamb kebabs, you'd probably want to pause and savor a bite before charging into battle, right? Among the most striking things that struck the Macedonians was the sheer variety of spices and herbs that filled Persian kitchens. The Persians, famed for their love of flavor, were masters of seasoning, something Alexander's army would learn to appreciate as they pushed deeper into enemy territory. You have to imagine some soldiers with wide eyes as they encountered saffron, cumin, and coriander in their meals. But we have to ask, was there a point when these new foods made the soldiers pause, mid-march, for a little snack break? As the Macedonian army makes its way through Persia, they not only face military challenges but an entire new world of culinary delights. The sweet, sour, and savory contrasts found in Persian dishes, like the famous stews cooked with dried fruits, nuts, and lamb, were a far cry from their familiar, bland rations back home. With each new town they passed through, the soldiers likely found new foods to try, and many historians speculate that these meals contributed to maintaining morale. After all, if you've just fought a grueling battle, a nice bowl of pilaf could be the best form of motivation. Of course, Alexander was known for being decisive, even ruthless. But it's possible that his love for strategy wasn't just about conquering cities, it was about conquering flavors. The Persian experience may have given Alexander and his soldiers more than military victories. It gave them culinary experiences that would shape their future. In the midst of war, Food often has the power to soothe, to lift spirits, and to unite soldiers. Imagine the Macedonian soldier, worn from the dust of the Persian desert, biting into a savory stew and sharing a laugh with his comrades. For a brief moment, they might forget the overwhelming odds they face. After all, even an army of conquerors needs a little snack to keep them going. By the time Alexander and his army had settled into their Persian campaign, the heat of battle was no longer the only thing keeping them on edge. The ever-present rumble of hungry stomachs, combined with the constant strain of military strategy, began to make the simple task of staying fed an urgent priority. As they moved deeper into Persia, one question loomed large. Could they keep their stomachs as full as their ambitions? The Macedonian soldiers, while primarily soldiers, were also human. They didn't just need weapons and battle plans, they needed food. And not just any food, but something that could sustain them through the grueling marches and intense skirmishes. This is where Persian cuisine once again proved invaluable. As the army pushed eastward, some soldiers might have joked that the real secret weapon in Alexander's arsenal wasn't the phalanx or the cavalry, it was the spices that filled their bellies and gave them the energy to charge into battle. As they moved along the Euphrates, it's likely that the Macedonian soldiers' eyes widened at the variety of food they encountered. It's hard to ignore that these new ingredients might have given the soldiers a bit of a taste for conquest. Food, after all, has a way of making people feel invincible. Historians still argue whether Alexander's introduction to the Persian culinary world led to the diversification of his army's diet or if it was merely a short-lived affair. But in reality, it's likely that some soldiers savored Persian dishes, such as stewed lamb or saffron rice, long after they left Persian borders behind. Of course, it wasn't just the food that was new. The Macedonians, with their keen military minds, were always looking for an advantage. They learned quickly that maintaining a steady supply of food and water was just as important as strategy. And this is where Alexander's soldiers began to see the value of having local suppliers and traders to keep the supplies coming. As a conqueror, Alexander may have understood that keeping his army well-fed was as essential to victory as any battlefield tactic. But let's not get carried away. While these new foods were exciting, not all the soldiers were sold on the idea of Persian spices. Historians still argue whether some of the Macedonian troops viewed Persian dishes as a delightful break from their usual fare or if they thought of them as overly extravagant. The Macedonian diet was pretty basic, and suddenly being served stews and pilafs might have felt a bit overwhelming for some. Still, even if some soldiers turned up their noses at Persian cuisine, the practical benefits were undeniable. A hearty meal of lamb kebabs, served with fresh vegetables, gave the soldiers the energy they needed for the brutal battles that lay ahead. So, despite any grumbling, there's little doubt that the army, at least in part, found the sustenance they needed to continue their conquest. After all, even the most driven warriors can't fight on an empty stomach. With the army now firmly entrenched in Persian territory, the Macedonian soldiers, still riding high on their earlier victories, prepared for the next major test, the Battle of Granicus. But despite the glory of war on the horizon, one undeniable fact persisted. The soldiers were hungry, and their stomachs were in desperate need of a break. The battle itself was fierce. The Persian satraps, in an attempt to stymie Alexander's progress, set up a solid defense, leading to a brutal confrontation along the banks of the Granicus River. But as intense as the battle was, we can't help but wonder how many soldiers, in the heat of the action, took a second to grab a bite? It may seem trivial, but snacks have a way of popping up at unexpected moments. The Macedonian soldiers, despite their discipline, were still humans who required food to keep moving. Their training had prepared them for battle, but nothing had quite prepared them for the physical toll this kind of long-distance warfare would take. So, while history books focus on Alexander's military genius and his ability to outmaneuver his foes, the truth is that as the army readied itself for battle, they were also trying to make sure that everyone had enough energy for what was about to unfold. In the lead-up to the battle, there's a possibility that many soldiers relied on quick snacks to get them through the day. A handful of dried fruit, a loaf of bread, things that could easily be packed into their satchels. It's said that Alexander was a sharp leader, and we can only imagine that he knew the importance of keeping morale high. So, was there a break in the action for a quick snack? Historians still debate whether Alexander's forces might have paused before their fight for a snack break. Perhaps even the great conqueror himself took a moment to gather his thoughts while munching on something simple. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were sustained by food. Historical accounts suggest that Alexander himself was not immune to the temptations of a good meal. Whether it was a hearty Persian stew or just a simple piece of bread, Alexander knew that eating well was an essential part of leading an army to success. Still, his focus was clear. Victory was the ultimate goal. That said, he might have found it necessary to turn to snacks to keep his mind sharp and his body energized during such long campaigns. As the Macedonian army surged into battle and overwhelmed the Persian forces, it's easy to imagine that they celebrated their victory with, what else? More food. A quick feast, perhaps, consisting of whatever provisions the soldiers could grab. A few kebabs, some bread, maybe a bit of local cheese. And if you think about it, there's no better way to enjoy a hard-fought victory than with a meal shared among brothers in arms. The food was just as much a part of the journey as the weapons and the strategy. In the heat of war, snacks provided not just fuel for the body, but an essential sense of comfort and camaraderie. After their victory at the Battle of Granicus, Alexander and his army began to press further east, moving deeper into Persian territory. With the momentum of their success, the soldiers were still riding high, their spirits lifted by the taste of triumph. But the further they ventured, the more they found themselves facing the challenges of unfamiliar terrain, harsh climates, and, of course, the ever-present hunger that came with long marches and short supply lines. As they reached the edge of the Persian Empire and turned their sights toward India, a new chapter in their journey unfolded. The landscape shifted dramatically, and the troops found themselves on the precipice of the unknown. The mountains loomed large ahead, and with them came the promise of even more battles, but also the opportunity to experience a new and exotic world, one that was, perhaps surprisingly, full of new culinary delights. Imagine this. The Macedonian soldiers, accustomed to a relatively simple diet of bread, cheese, and dried meat, now found themselves in a land where spices flowed freely and food was seasoned with herbs and flavors they had never tasted before. Historians still argue whether Alexander himself was as excited about these culinary discoveries as his men were. We know he was a lover of luxury and opulence, so it's not far-fetched to think that, while conquering cities, he was also eagerly sampling the local fare. After all, when you're marching to the farthest reaches of the known world, it's nice to have something other than bread and wine to look forward to. The introduction to Indian cuisine was a game changer. The soldiers, many of whom had probably never tasted spices like turmeric or cumin, found themselves tantalized by these bold flavors. Dishes like biryani, with its aromatic rice and rich meat stews, likely offered a welcome break from the usual fare of grilled meat and flatbread. For a brief moment, the soldiers may have forgotten the dangers of battle and focused instead on savoring the rich, warm spices that permeated the air. Historians still argue whether Alexander's introduction to Indian spices led to a lasting cultural exchange, but it's clear that food, along with the military conquest, played a key role in cementing his legacy. The journey into India wasn't just about fighting. It was also about survival in a new environment, and that meant learning how to adapt. The soldiers found new sources of nourishment in the lands they passed through, from fresh fruits like mangoes and papayas to locally grown grains. Even though the army was focused on war, it's likely that the men took every opportunity to sample the exotic foods they encountered. Some historians even suggest that Alexander's men may have stopped for snack breaks in between battles as a way to stave off fatigue and boost morale. It's important to remember that even the most disciplined of soldiers aren't impervious to the comfort that a well-prepared meal can bring. As Alexander's army continued to march deeper into India, they found not only new challenges but also new opportunities to refuel, recharge, and indulge in the culinary delights of the subcontinent. Though these snack breaks may not have been recorded in official military annals, it's highly likely that they played a small but crucial role in keeping the soldiers going, especially as they faced the hardships of unfamiliar terrain and prolonged warfare. As Alexander's army pressed on towards the famous Battle of the Hydaspes, they faced one of the greatest challenges of their entire campaign, crossing a powerful, fast-moving river that separated them from King Porus' army. It was no ordinary river. This was the Hydaspes, wide and treacherous. The crossing would require every bit of strategy and precision that Alexander was known for. Yet, amid the looming battle and the river's formidable current, there was something else on the soldiers' minds: food. After all, battles might be won on the field, but survival in hostile environments often depends on the smallest of comforts, like a quick bite to eat. The crossing of the Hydaspes, one of the most significant moments in Alexander's campaign, also marked a brief respite for the soldiers. With no immediate threats on the horizon and the riverbank offering a temporary safe haven, it's likely that many soldiers found a few moments to steal away for a snack. Though the military historians of the day were more focused on the tactics of the battle, it's essential to consider how the soldiers were preparing themselves physically. The Macedonian army had already endured months of harsh conditions, and as they prepared to cross the Hydaspes, many would have been desperate for something more substantial than their usual rations of dried fish and flatbread. The Macedonian army was well equipped for battle, but when it came to logistics and food supplies, they were increasingly relying on local resources to keep them fueled. At this point, it's reasonable to assume that the soldiers were indulging in what they could find locally, perhaps fresh fruits, grains, or the famous river fish that the region was known for. Historians still debate whether Alexander, in his military brilliance, might have timed the crossing and subsequent battle to allow for the maximum opportunity for his soldiers to rehydrate and replenish their energy with food. Some say that this was part of the great leader's plan to keep morale high in the face of such challenging terrain and conditions. Though the Macedonian soldiers' focus remained squarely on the forthcoming battle, the question remains: did they enjoy a quick snack or meal to fuel themselves before entering one of the most famous battles of Alexander's career? It's not a trivial consideration. A well-fed army, after all, is a strong army. And while the generals were certainly concerned with strategy, the fact remains that Alexander was well aware of the importance of keeping his men's spirits and stomachs satisfied. Once the soldiers finally crossed the Hydaspes and came face to face with King Porus' forces, it was clear that the battle would be one for the ages. The soldiers, now well-rested and perhaps slightly better fed, attacked with their usual ferocity, ultimately leading to a decisive victory. But even in the midst of their triumph, one can imagine a brief but necessary break afterwards. Some food, some rest, and perhaps even the luxury of savoring the spices and fruits that had become a hallmark of their journey through Persia and India. The Macedonian soldiers, battle-hardened and hungry, were able to conquer yet another challenge, in no small part because of their ability to adapt to their surroundings, and that included their ever-evolving relationship with food. Whether it was the fish from the river or fruit from the trees, these small but significant snacks gave the soldiers the energy they needed to take on Porus' forces. They weren't just fueled by their weapons or tactics, they were fueled by the very land they were marching through. After the intense and victorious battle of the Hydaspes, the Macedonian army found itself once again at a critical juncture, both geographically and physically. With King Porus defeated, Alexander and his troops began to march deeper into India, but the journey was far from over. The soldiers, although victorious, were beginning to feel the weight of the long campaign. The rivers and mountains had taken their toll, and now the challenge would be to keep the army's strength up, not just through strategy and discipline, but also by ensuring they had enough food and rest. The Hydaspes river crossing marked a pivotal moment, not just in terms of battle, but in terms of resources. For any army, logistics are as critical as military prowess, and the Macedonian army was no different. The challenge was now to secure enough supplies, particularly food, to maintain morale as they pushed further into the unknown. The harsh realities of the campaign, extreme weather, rough terrain, and long stretches between rest stops, meant that fresh food was not always guaranteed. Historians still debate how much food was truly available to the soldiers at this point in the campaign. Some suggest that Alexander, ever the pragmatist, understood the importance of local resources and made efforts to ensure that his troops had access to the freshest ingredients they could find. Others argue that, given the state of the army, soldiers may have had to make do with less than ideal provisions. Whatever the case, Alexander's army was now in a situation where their diets had been influenced by the regions they marched through. And with India's varied landscapes came a whole new world of culinary opportunities. As they ventured further into India, the Macedonian soldiers likely found themselves relying more heavily on local produce. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and spices were now regular additions to their meals, providing much-needed vitamins and nutrients. It's highly probable that the soldiers began incorporating more local flavors into their rations, giving them a small but significant break from the monotonous diet they had been living on for months. Perhaps some soldiers even discovered the joy of a good mango, a treat many of them had likely never tasted before. The introduction of new foods may have been one of the only bright spots as they marched further into unknown territories. However, while Alexander's army was now exposed to these new and exciting foods, it wasn't all fun and games. The further the soldiers marched, the more they encountered obstacles, from hostile forces to difficult weather conditions. In the face of these challenges, their diet became an even more vital part of their survival. It's possible that, even as Alexander's forces continued to dominate on the battlefield, they struggled to keep up with the demand for food, water, and other supplies. Local suppliers were critical, but in a land as vast as India, those resources didn't always come easily. But there was a silver lining. With their growing exposure to Indian culinary traditions, the Macedonian soldiers were not only keeping their stomachs full, they were also gaining an appreciation for a completely different way of life. The spices and ingredients they encountered would likely stay with them long after they left India. Historians speculate that many of these foods made their way back to Greece, influencing the Mediterranean diet for centuries to come. The Macedonian soldiers, in their conquests, had inadvertently helped establish a culinary bridge between the East and West, creating a lasting legacy of food exchange. As the soldiers continued their march, the importance of food and nourishment was never far from their minds. The battle for survival wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the food they ate, the energy they derived from it, and the shared experiences that came from sitting around a campfire eating together. Though history remembers Alexander the Great for his military genius, his army's triumphs were also powered by the simple yet essential act of eating. With the Macedonian army still on the march after their victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's men found themselves in a battle of a different kind, one that wasn't fought with weapons, but with hunger. The push eastward into the Indian subcontinent, now filled with rich food offerings but also plagued by scarce resources in some regions, meant that feeding a massive army became a logistical nightmare. As the soldiers marched through unfamiliar territories, they began to face a scarcity of supplies. The land was harsh, and the resources they had relied upon in Persia were no longer as readily available. This shift marked a crucial moment in the campaign. Just as Alexander's army had secured victory after victory, the physical toll on the men started to show. Their once reliable food supplies began to dwindle, and hunger loomed as large as the next battle. Historians still argue over the exact details of the Macedonian diet during these final stages of the campaign, but one thing is clear: it was during this time that Alexander's army had to adapt in ways they hadn't before. No longer could they rely on the abundance of Persian markets or the exotic spices of India. They were faced with the prospect of survival on bare rations, dried meat, hardtack, and whatever could be scavenged from the land. The soldiers, undoubtedly worn from the heat and fatigue, might have found their stomachs growling more loudly than the battle cries of their enemies. At this point, many historians suggest that the Macedonian army likely had to make do with whatever local provisions they could find. But more than just rice and fruits, the troops also found themselves experimenting with new foods in a desperate bid for nutrition. Local grains and legumes were introduced to the soldiers' diet, but their integration wasn't without its challenges. Some of the foods didn't sit well with their stomachs, and new ingredients like chickpeas and lentils were a far cry from their usual meat-heavy fare. The soldiers were stuck between their familiar diets and the new world they had found themselves in, often navigating between convenience and necessity. This is where the question of snacks comes into play once more. After long, difficult days of marching, after fighting, and after crossing rivers like the Hydaspes, how many soldiers paused to grab a snack before heading back into action? It's likely that, more than ever, soldiers were turning to quick, portable snacks to fill the gaps between larger meals, local fruits, nuts, and maybe even a hasty fish caught from nearby waters. At the same time, Alexander, ever the strategist, must have understood that keeping his men fed and motivated was critical to the continued success of the campaign. While the soldiers were digging into whatever food they could find, it's possible that Alexander's leadership extended to securing the best rations possible, even in difficult conditions. Supplies were often inconsistent, but the Macedonian king, famed for his adaptability, would have pushed his logistics officers to scour every region for food sources that could help maintain the strength and morale of his army. Despite the dwindling supplies, Alexander's army, as always, adapted. The soldiers, even in the face of hunger, would have found small ways to make their food a part of their battle strategy. Perhaps a quick snack of local fruits or a cup of yogurt helped keep them going as they pressed on. What the Macedonian army lacked in abundant supplies, they made up for in resilience. This combination of grit, determination, and strategic food management was what kept them fighting, even when their bodies were exhausted. In the heat of battle and the long days of marching, it wasn't just sword and shield that sustained Alexander's army. It was the small, seemingly trivial acts of nourishing their bodies that kept the soldiers going. As they entered new lands, braving new terrains, and facing hostile forces, it was the simple yet profound power of food that continued to play an essential role in Alexander's war machine. As the Macedonian army pushed further into the vast subcontinent, the soldiers found themselves in an increasingly challenging situation. The heat was oppressive, the terrain treacherous, and the length of the campaign was starting to weigh heavily on both body and mind. With each passing day, Alexander's soldiers had to reconcile their incredible military successes with the harsh realities of their journey, long marches, violent battles, and dwindling resources. One of the more pressing issues became the matter of food. While the soldiers had grown accustomed to surviving on basic provisions like dried meat, bread, and salted fish, the further they went into India, the more difficult it became to maintain a steady supply of food. Local sources were inconsistent, and the supply chains the army had relied upon were starting to fray at the edges. As they ventured deeper into unfamiliar terrain, their diets began to change in subtle ways, but the question was, could food really hold the army together at this critical point? Historians still debate how much the Macedonian soldiers relied on local suppliers or traders to keep them fed, but it's clear that their military focus was now as much about securing provisions as it was about securing territory. At the same time, Alexander's army began to lean more on the food sources provided by the land itself. Foraging for local fruits and vegetables became a necessity as the troops struggled to find enough of their usual rations. Grains like millet and barley likely became staples in their diet, while fresh fruits like bananas and mangoes provided some much-needed sweetness and energy. But even as the Macedonian army adapted to this new, somewhat more eclectic diet, the soldiers still needed quick sources of sustenance. During long marches, there were few chances to sit down for elaborate meals. Instead, many soldiers likely found themselves snacking on the go, grabbing what they could between stretches of battle and travel. The importance of these small breaks, whether it was a handful of dried fruits or a quick drink of water, wasn't lost on the soldiers. A simple snack, after all, could be the difference between fighting with focus or succumbing to fatigue. While Alexander's army faced this growing logistical challenge, their resilience was a defining characteristic. Even when resources were scarce, they found ways to keep going. The men had likely become masters at making the most of what they could forage or trade for. For instance, they could have relied on locally available nuts, such as cashews or almonds, to provide the calories needed for the long days ahead. These small but essential snacks gave the soldiers the energy to continue the difficult trek towards the Ganges, even as their food reserves continued to shrink. As their journey through India stretched on, it became increasingly clear that Alexander's forces were not just an army of conquerors, they were also an army of survivalists. Food, something that we often take for granted, became a strategic asset in this war for territory. And as they pressed further, the Macedonian soldiers were also pushing the limits of what they could endure, not just in battle, but in the ways they kept themselves nourished. But even the mightiest of armies had their limits. Alexander, once unstoppable and undefeated, faced a moment when his soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and far from home, began to show signs of mutiny. The road ahead seemed too long, too harsh. The promise of further conquest now seemed less appealing when compared to the physical toll they had already endured. Alexander had pushed his men to the brink, but the one thing he could not push was their need for rest and nourishment. Despite these tensions, the Macedonian soldiers were still a highly disciplined force, and many would have followed Alexander to the ends of the earth if it meant victory. Yet, their need for sustenance became undeniable. Perhaps, in one final ironic twist, it wasn't just Alexander's military genius that would keep the army intact, but the simple act of eating, a necessity that not even a great conqueror could conquer. It's often said that the true measure of a soldier's resilience is not just in their ability to fight, but in how they endure the grueling conditions of the journey. For Alexander's army, this moment would test them in ways that not even the most skilled generals could anticipate. The long march through India, the ceaseless heat, the endless battles, all of it took a toll on the soldiers. Yet, as they reached the edge of the known world, the Macedonian forces found themselves facing an even greater challenge: the psychological and physical weight of exhaustion. At this point, the soldiers had conquered vast stretches of land, fought countless battles, and seen victory after victory. But now, as they approached the banks of the Bios River, many of them began to question whether the campaign was worth the cost. The idea of pushing further into the unknown, with no clear end in sight, began to wear on the men. For the first time, the mighty Macedonian army was faced with a crisis of morale. Historians still debate the precise moment when Alexander's soldiers turned their backs on further conquest, but it's widely accepted that, as they reached the Bios River, many soldiers openly mutinied. They refused to march any further eastward, and the prospect of crossing into even more dangerous territories was met with resistance. This wasn't just a military retreat, it was a crucial turning point in Alexander's campaign, where the physical demands of warfare collided with the mental exhaustion of his men. But what role did food play in this pivotal moment? It's easy to assume that the army's lack of adequate provisions was a contributing factor to the soldiers' discontent. While they had made do with local resources, the reality of eating unfamiliar foods, coupled with the uncertainty of the supply lines, likely led to a sense of dissatisfaction. As much as the soldiers had adapted to their new diet, there's little doubt that the constant search for food, the lack of fresh supplies, and the challenges of sustaining such a large army must have worn them down. It wasn't just about the physical toll. Food shortages, combined with the heat and relentless pace of the campaign, likely contributed to the soldiers' growing sense of desperation. Some historians argue that, in their exhaustion, the soldiers may have felt that no amount of victory was worth the continuing hardship of marching through foreign lands with unpredictable access to food. The constant uncertainty of what they would eat next, and when they would eat, surely played a role in their decision to halt. In the end, it wasn't just Alexander's military genius that held the army together. It was the small, everyday acts of survival, like ensuring their rations were filled, that had kept the soldiers going this far. But once that delicate balance of food, rest, and morale began to fray, the limits of their endurance became clear. As much as Alexander had led his men through impossible battles and harsh terrains, the one thing even the greatest conqueror couldn't do was force them to march on when their bodies and their spirits were broken. The mutiny at the Bios River marked the moment when Alexander's dream of reaching the edge of the world came to an abrupt halt. His soldiers, who had followed him across vast empires and endured countless hardships, were now making a stand for themselves. No longer driven by the promise of victory, they sought only rest, sustenance, and a return to the familiarity of home. As the Macedonian army turned around, heading back west, the question on many of their minds wasn't how to conquer the next land, but when they could finally have a proper meal, rest for more than just a few hours, and put their feet up for once. The future seemed uncertain, and even Alexander, faced with the decision to turn back, couldn't deny that his men's hunger, for both food and rest, was greater than their hunger for more conquest. As Alexander's army retraced its steps westward, back through the lands they had conquered, the atmosphere within the ranks had dramatically shifted. The victorious, exuberant force that had once marched forward with unyielding confidence was now weary and disillusioned. They were an army that had tasted the glory of conquest but was now being forced to face the reality of their own limitations. The relentless pursuit of Alexander's dream to reach the edge of the world had come to a halt. And yet, amid this turning point, food once again played a pivotal role in the journey home. In the wake of their decision to retreat, the soldiers likely found themselves more focused on the basics of survival. Having been exposed to new foods and cuisines throughout their journey, the men had come to rely on the fresh fruits, vegetables, and local dishes they had encountered in India. It's said that Alexander himself, a lover of indulgence and luxury, had enjoyed the rich, aromatic flavors of Indian food. But as they moved back through familiar lands, the army's diet began to return to simpler, more familiar staples: bread, olives, and salted meats. The Macedonian soldiers, once eager to try the exotic dishes of Persia and India, now found comfort in the foods that reminded them of home. But not all soldiers were pleased with the return to basic rations. There's a chance that, after having tasted the fresh fruits and spices of India, many of them longed for the flavors they had once savored. Historians still debate whether the soldiers' desire for new culinary experiences played a part in the unrest that led to their mutiny at the Bios River. Was there a deeper longing for the luxuries of the lands they had conquered? Perhaps some soldiers, having tasted the abundance of the East, resented the return to the same old dried meat and bread. However, the reality of their journey was that, despite their longing for more flavorful foods, the army had to make do with what was available. The supply lines were stretched thin, and as they made their way westward, the army began to face the same logistical challenges they had encountered earlier in the campaign. The further they marched, the more difficult it became to secure provisions, especially given the immense size of the army. It's likely that the soldiers' rations consisted of whatever they could carry or forage along the way. Even Alexander, who had orchestrated the most extraordinary military campaigns in history, had to deal with the practicalities of feeding an army on the move. But even as the soldiers turned their backs on further conquest, they were not entirely without hope. As they made their way back to more familiar regions, the supply of food likely improved. Trade routes were more established, and local resources were more easily accessible. The soldiers, still tired and hungry, were able to replenish their supplies and enjoy some much-needed nourishment. Perhaps there was a collective sense of relief as they indulged in familiar foods once again. Cheese, bread, and wine, all things that had been absent for far too long. The taste of home, even if it wasn't as exotic as the flavors they had encountered in Persia or India, must have been a comforting reminder of their achievements. At this stage of the journey, the Macedonian soldiers were no longer just an army, they were a group of men who had been transformed by their experiences. They had marched through the known world, conquered vast empires, and tasted foods that most people could only dream of. They had fought for years in unfamiliar lands, forging bonds through shared hardship and triumph. Now, as they headed back toward home, the importance of food in their daily lives was even more apparent. It wasn't just about the fuel for their bodies, it was about the comfort of familiarity, the security of knowing where their next meal would come from. The soldiers, now weary and looking ahead to their return to Macedonia, may have reflected on the strange, unforgettable flavors they had encountered on their journey. Whether it was the fiery spices of India or the rich stews of Persia, food had played a vital role in their survival and success. But it was the simple foods of home that would provide the soldiers with the strength they needed to complete the journey back. And as they marched westward, Alexander and his men would no longer be thinking about the unknown lands ahead, but about the meals, the rest, and the peace they hoped to find at the end of their long journey. As Alexander's army began its long march back toward Greece, the soldiers were faced with a strange sense of relief. They were returning from the very lands they had once dreamt of conquering, but now their minds were less focused on the glory of battle and more on the simple pleasures of home. The endless fields of Persia, the spices of India, the battlefields they'd crossed, these were now fading memories. What remained was the ever-present need for food, rest, and the promise of comfort. After years of enduring harsh conditions, unfamiliar foods, and the constant grind of war, the soldiers' thoughts turned inward, focusing on the most fundamental need, survival. But it wasn't just the lack of supplies that had become a problem, it was also the mental exhaustion that had set in. The constant quest for new territories and the endless march eastward had led to a shift in the soldiers' mindset. They had experienced the thrill of conquest, but now that thrill had begun to fade. Many of the soldiers who had once followed Alexander with unwavering loyalty were now feeling the weight of their journey. Historians still argue whether the soldiers' decision to stop and demand a return home was purely about exhaustion or whether their longing for more familiar food, the taste of their native diets, played a larger role in their reluctance to continue. It's hard to imagine a soldier who had spent months in the scorching heat of Persia and the humid forests of India not yearning for a simple, hearty meal, the kind they knew they could get back in Greece. Sure, they had tasted the sweetness of Indian mangoes, the richness of Persian kebabs, and the earthiness of local stews. But these flavors had not sustained them in the same way that the familiarity of a Mediterranean diet could. The soldiers were homesick, longing for the warmth of their homeland, and food, unquestionably one of the simplest comforts, was part of that. As they moved west, through Persia once again, the soldiers were now able to access more familiar foods. Bread, cheese, olives, and wine made their return, and for the first time in what must have seemed like an eternity, the soldiers could finally enjoy a meal without the looming anxiety of an uncertain supply line. It's likely that these foods were a source of great comfort and morale for the men, who had spent so long eating foods that were unfamiliar or difficult to stomach. The joy of a fresh loaf of bread, the tangy taste of ripe olives, and the warmth of a simple meal likely offered a brief reprieve from the physical and emotional toll of their journey. But despite the comfort that these familiar foods brought, the soldiers' minds were still on the future. They had reached the point of no return, their campaign had ended, and they were heading back home. They had conquered empires, crossed vast stretches of desert, and faced innumerable hardships. And yet, the end of this journey was not marked by triumph, but by weariness and a desire for rest. For many of the soldiers, this final march back to Greece was not about the glory of their victories, but about reaching the comfort and familiarity they had longed for throughout their campaign. The return to home wasn't just a physical journey, it was a return to the security of home life, where food was simple, reliable, and comforting. It was the return to a world where the next meal wasn't uncertain, where bread could be eaten without the fear of running out, where wine could flow freely without the fear of scarcity. The Macedonian soldiers, who had once fought so fiercely for every inch of land, now fought for the most basic of things, rest and the comfort of familiar sustenance. The end of their journey was not marked by the glory of conquest, but by the quiet satisfaction of returning to a life they had left behind. As they entered the lands of Macedonia, the soldiers knew that the end of their long journey was finally in sight. Their bodies, still bruised and weary from years of warfare, could finally rest. And in this rest, food once again played a central role. No longer did they have to forage for whatever they could find or settle for rations that barely kept them alive. Now, they could return to the simplicity of home-cooked meals, of fresh meats, vegetables, and the comfort of familiar flavors. And as they crossed the border into their homeland, the soldiers would finally realize the true value of what they had fought for, not just empires, but the fundamental comforts of life, food, rest, and the peace that came with returning home. As the Macedonian soldiers crossed the borders of their homeland, their weary eyes must have reflected a profound sense of relief. After years of fighting, marching, and enduring the hardships of distant lands, they were finally back in the world they had once known. Alexander's army, battle-worn and exhausted, had long since traded their dreams of further conquest for the immediate comfort of home, and with that comfort came an undeniable sense of nostalgia for the foods and rituals they had left behind. For these soldiers, the act of returning home wasn't just about stepping foot on familiar soil. It was about reconnecting with the comforts they had left behind, not least of which was food. No longer would they have to forage for unfamiliar fruits or wonder what strange new spices they would encounter each day. The soldiers could look forward to the hearty meals they had grown up with: lamb roasting over an open fire, olives harvested from familiar groves, and a wine so rich in taste it could revive the spirit as much as the body. In the years they had spent campaigning across the Persian Empire and India, the soldiers had encountered a variety of new foods. They had tasted the richness of Persian stews, the spices of Indian curry, and the sweet fruits of the East. But these experiences were fleeting, a temporary diversion from the simpler meals they had always known. Now, as they marched home, those familiar flavors beckoned, offering a comfort that the soldiers had sorely missed. Historians still argue whether Alexander himself was among those soldiers who, upon returning to Macedon, embraced the familiar tastes of home. Alexander, after all, had become known for his appreciation of luxury, and it's likely that the comfort of home-cooked meals had a powerful pull on him as well. It's said that even he, the great conqueror, needed the solace of a well-prepared meal after the exhaustion of his lengthy campaign. So, as his army crossed into the familiar landscapes of Greece, it's not hard to imagine Alexander sharing a moment of quiet enjoyment with his soldiers over a meal of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and aged wine. However, returning to Macedonia wasn't just about the food, it was about the process of reintegration. The soldiers who had been on the road for so long, living in harsh conditions, were now slowly coming back to a world where stability and comfort awaited them. They had fought for years to conquer empires, but in the end, it was the simple pleasures that they truly craved. The longing for a taste of home had been one of the driving forces behind their retreat from India. Now that they had returned, it was no longer about distant lands or future conquests. It was about the ability to sit down at a table, share a meal with comrades, and enjoy the peace that had so long been denied to them. For the Macedonian soldiers, the return to home and food signified not just the end of a campaign, but the end of a journey that had taken them to the edges of the known world. They had crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains, battling enemies and braving unfamiliar terrain. But at the end of it all, it was the promise of familiar meals, of shared bread, of roasted meats, of the comfort of home, that offered them the true reward of their long journey. And perhaps this is the legacy of Alexander's great campaign. While his name is forever associated with military brilliance and the creation of one of history's largest empires, it's worth remembering that even the most fearsome conquerors were still human. They too longed for the simple comforts of home, food, rest, and the peace of returning to a world they had once known. As the Macedonian soldiers, tired but triumphant, walked through the familiar streets of their homeland, they could finally savor the comforts of the life they had fought so hard to protect. And in this moment of homecoming, food once again proved to be a central part of their story. For all the battles they had fought and the lands they had conquered, it was the meals they shared with comrades and the taste of familiarity that offered them the greatest comfort in the end. The long journey back to Macedonia was not just a physical return, it was a cultural reintegration. After spending years in foreign lands, Persia, Egypt, and the vast expanses of India, Alexander's soldiers had seen and tasted things that few men could ever imagine. They had experienced the luxuries of foreign courts, sampled rich, spiced dishes, and encountered new ways of living. But now, as they arrived back in their homeland, the contrast between what they had encountered abroad and what awaited them in Greece must have felt stark. The soldiers had witnessed the wonders of the East, India's exotic fruits, the spices of Persia, and the culinary sophistication of the ancient world's great empires. But as they stepped into the fertile soil of Macedonia, they would likely have been greeted by a world that was simpler, quieter, and more familiar. Gone were the complex curries and bold, unfamiliar spices. Instead, they were met by the straightforward yet satisfying flavors of Mediterranean cuisine. The moment of homecoming wasn't marked just by the sight of their homeland, but also by the return of their staple foods: bread, olive oil, fresh cheese, and meats roasted over an open flame. To many soldiers, these were the tastes they had longed for in their years of campaign. In Persia and India, they had eaten well enough, but it wasn't the same as the earthy, hearty meals of their childhood. Now, as they settled back into their homes, they could once again enjoy the simplicity of Macedonian meals: a warm loaf of bread, fresh olives, and a glass of locally made wine. Even Alexander himself, having been exposed to the extravagance of Persian and Indian courts, must have found comfort in the foods of his homeland. Despite his love of luxury, he had always retained a connection to his roots. Perhaps, in a rare moment of quiet reflection, Alexander indulged in a simple meal: bread, olives, a roasted lamb shoulder, sharing it with his generals and soldiers who had followed him through the trials of the East. This return to simplicity, after years of indulgence in the exotic, was likely a humbling experience for the king and his men alike. Historians have long debated Alexander's true feelings as he returned to Macedonia. Was he content with the empire he had created, or did the simplicity of home leave him yearning for more? After all, Alexander had spent his entire life seeking out the unknown, conquering lands, and tasting new experiences. Could the quiet pleasures of home satisfy a man who had tasted the grandeur of Persia and India? It's a question that remains unanswered, but there's something profound about the fact that, despite all his conquests, the final satisfaction for Alexander and his army came not from further victories, but from the simple pleasures of home. As the Macedonian soldiers reunited with their families, there must have been a collective sense of relief, a return to stability, to familiar customs, to the rhythms of daily life. The great warriors who had marched through foreign lands now found themselves sitting at tables, enjoying meals that reminded them of everything they had fought to preserve. The food that had once been a luxury, a distraction from the hardships of war, was now a symbol of homecoming. And yet, even as they found comfort in the foods of Macedonia, the soldiers were forever changed. They had seen the vastness of the world and tasted the spices of distant empires. But the simpler, more familiar foods of home were no longer just sustenance. They were a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the bond that tied the soldiers to their land. They had been through the fire, had crossed deserts, fought battles, and overcome adversity. And now, with a meal in hand, they could finally rest, knowing that their journey was complete. The final stage of Alexander's journey was not just a return to Macedonia, but a return to what he had fought so fiercely to protect. His army had marched across vast empires, crossed treacherous rivers, and fought innumerable battles. Yet, the true reward of their journey was not found in the riches of Persia or the splendor of India. It was found in the simple, familiar comforts of home. As the Macedonian soldiers settled back into their homeland, the sights, smells, and tastes of their daily lives began to take on new significance. The olive trees, the open fields, and the vineyards, things that once seemed ordinary, now symbolized the stability and peace they had fought for. The soldiers, once eager for further conquests, now found solace in the routines of home, where the food was simple and nourishing, and the days were measured by the harvests rather than the conquests. For Alexander, the homecoming was likely a complex experience. Having conquered most of the known world, what was there left to conquer? The boundaries of his empire were vast, but his soldiers had reached their limit. They had experienced the grandeur of the East, tasted its delicacies, and seen the wonders of ancient civilizations. But now, as they sat down to simple meals with their families, the ultimate truth began to settle in. What they had achieved could not be surpassed by further conquest. The greatest victory had been the one they had won together, the survival of the journey, the loyalty of comrades, and the preservation of their homeland. In many ways, the return to familiar food was symbolic of the deeper return to something fundamental, something unshakable. Alexander's soldiers, who had endured so much, had now reached a place of peace, where the worries of warfare were replaced by the joys of daily life. No longer did they need to fear starvation or uncertain supplies. The familiar meals, shared with loved ones, were a reminder of their resilience and endurance. As they savored the flavors of home, whether it was a simple lamb roast, freshly baked bread, or a cup of wine, the soldiers were not just nourished physically, they were nourished in spirit. Alexander's vision had always been about creating something greater than himself, an empire that spanned continents. And while his empire remained intact, the true legacy of his journey lay not in the territory he conquered, but in the lessons he learned along the way. The simple act of eating, of sharing food with those they loved, was the moment where Alexander and his soldiers could finally acknowledge that their journey had come full circle. In their final return to Macedonia, food became the bridge between the past and the future, between war and peace. The soldiers who had once eaten whatever they could find in the deserts of Persia or the forests of India now found comfort in the familiar. They no longer needed to conquer new lands. They had already conquered the greatest challenge of all, survival. Now, with a meal shared in the company of comrades and family, they could rest, knowing that the hardest part of the journey was behind them. This return to peace, marked by the simple pleasures of food and home, was perhaps Alexander's greatest triumph. Not in the vastness of his empire, but in the small moments of respite, where his soldiers could finally put down their swords and pick up a fork. It was these moments, these shared meals, that would become the true measure of their journey. As the Macedonian army began to settle back into the rhythms of life in Greece, it became increasingly clear that the journey they had undertaken, one filled with military victories, exotic lands, and countless challenges, had transformed them in ways beyond the physical. For Alexander's soldiers, who had once thrived on the thrill of conquest, the return to peace, to the quiet simplicity of home, was a bittersweet experience. They had crossed oceans, marched through deserts, and fought armies far from their homeland. But what remained now, after years of hardship, was the sense of coming full circle, a return to familiar things, a reconnection to what they had fought to preserve: home, family, and the everyday comforts of life. In the quiet days after their return, many soldiers likely found themselves reminiscing about the lands they had conquered, the strange new foods they had tasted, and the unusual experiences that had once seemed so distant. They had seen the grandeur of Persia, tasted the spices of India, and fought on the shores of Egypt. But now, sitting with their families, surrounded by the simple comforts of their homeland, they must have realized that, in the end, the things that mattered most were not the riches or the vastness of an empire. It was the small moments, the shared meals with loved ones, the laughter around a table, the familiar smells of bread baking in the oven, that brought them true peace. And as they sat down to these familiar meals, there was no denying that food had played a critical role in their journey. From the earliest days of the campaign, when the soldiers had relied on the basic rations of bread and dried meat, to their time in Persia and India, where they encountered rich spices and exotic dishes, food had not only been fuel but also a source of comfort. During the battles, it was often a quick bite of bread or dried fruit that kept them going between skirmishes. And when they finally reached the edge of the world, it was the food they shared around campfires that helped them keep their spirits high. Now, back in Macedonia, they were surrounded by the familiar sights and tastes of home. The soldiers could finally relax, knowing that the uncertainty of their meals had passed. No longer did they need to worry about what they would eat next or where they would find their next supply of provisions. The abundance of Greece, its olive groves, its vineyards, its fields of grain, offered a sense of stability and abundance that they had long been without. And perhaps, in these moments of reflection, Alexander himself found solace in the same comforts. His campaigns had pushed him to the farthest corners of the earth, but now, as he sat with his men around the table, he too could find comfort in the simplicity of familiar food. His mind, once obsessed with conquering the known world, could now rest as he shared a quiet meal with those who had followed him into battle. The simple act of eating, of breaking bread with his soldiers, must have been a moment of quiet victory, not the kind that is celebrated with trumpets and parades, but a victory of survival, of endurance, of returning to a place where they could finally be at peace. Historians still debate the emotional and psychological toll of Alexander's journey. Was his conquest of the East driven by ambition alone, or did he seek something deeper, a sense of fulfillment that could only be found through these shared experiences? Perhaps, after years of leading his army across vast distances and tasting the richness of foreign lands, he found true satisfaction not in new conquests but in returning to the simplicity of home. For his soldiers, the end of the journey was not about glory or fame. It was about finding peace in the everyday, in the food they ate, and in the camaraderie they had shared. In the end, Alexander's great campaign didn't just shape the world, it shaped the men who followed him. They returned home not as just warriors, but as men who had tasted the breadth of the world, who had survived its trials, and who had learned that the greatest rewards in life often come in the simplest forms. For these soldiers, the act of eating together, of sharing meals with family and friends, was the true victory. It was a victory that had been earned not on the battlefield, but through their endurance, their resilience, and their unwavering connection to home. As the Macedonian army began to reintegrate into the life they had left behind, the echo of their distant victories grew quieter. The soldiers, once so focused on conquest and glory, now found themselves faced with the quiet demands of life at home. They had earned their place in history through blood, sweat, and tears, but now, as they sat at the dinner tables of their villages, the weight of those victories felt distant, almost surreal. The taste of exotic spices and unfamiliar flavors lingered in their memories, but it was the comfort of familiar meals, simple, nourishing food, that offered them the peace they had so long been denied. As Alexander's army slowly dissipated, soldiers returned to their farms, to their families, to the lives they had left behind. The land, which they had fought to protect, now provided the sustenance they so desperately needed. They might have spent years away from the comforting simplicity of bread, olive oil, and roasted meats, but now these foods were a reminder of the security they had preserved. For many soldiers, the end of their campaign meant the return to a life that, despite its challenges, was filled with familiar comforts. Yet, the return was not without its struggles. The war had changed them, and they were no longer the young men who had left their homes for distant lands. Their bodies had been hardened by years of battle, their minds shaped by the long stretches of uncertainty they had endured. The food they had once taken for granted now seemed more significant. Every meal, every shared moment with family, was a testament to their survival. For soldiers who had been through the horrors of war, a simple meal at home felt like a reward, a return to the basics of life. For Alexander, who had once been driven by the need to expand his empire and conquer new worlds, the return to home meant a return to something more personal, something that had eluded him during his years of conquest. Was there a sense of peace in the simplicity of home? Historians speculate on this often, wondering if Alexander, ever the ambitious conqueror, had longed for a sense of peace that could never be fully attained through victory. In the quiet moments, sharing a meal with his closest companions, perhaps he found something more lasting than any empire could offer, a sense of belonging, a feeling of contentment that transcended battlefields and borders. Even though Alexander had conquered vast empires, the true satisfaction came not from the endless expansion of his territory, but from the quiet joy of returning to something grounded and familiar. Perhaps this is why he was said to have returned home with a new perspective. The food that had sustained him on his journey, the meals shared with his army, and the meals now shared with his men and family back in Macedonia were a reminder of something far more valuable than conquest: the importance of home, the importance of community, and the importance of the simple things that make life worth living. In these quiet moments of reflection, perhaps the greatest lesson Alexander and his soldiers learned was the power of what they had fought for. It wasn't the gold, the land, or the glory. It was the preservation of something more meaningful, the life and comforts they had left behind. The men who had once marched across the known world now found their true peace in the humble meals that awaited them at the end of the journey. These simple meals were more than just sustenance. They were the physical manifestation of everything they had struggled for, everything they had survived. Alexander's legacy, and the legacy of his soldiers, was not just found in the cities they built, the lands they conquered, or the riches they amassed. It was found in the small moments, those moments when they sat down together to eat, when they shared food and stories, and when they returned to the warmth of home. After all, even the greatest conquerors need something more than victory. They need a place to rest, a place where food becomes more than just fuel, where it becomes a symbol of survival, resilience, and the quiet victory of returning home. As the years passed and the dust of their grand campaign settled, the soldiers of Alexander's army, once the most fearsome fighting force in the world, began to find new purposes in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. The farms, the vineyards, the hearths of their homes, all the things that had been temporarily abandoned for the sake of conquest, now became their focus once again. Though their bodies had returned, the memories of their extraordinary journey, the tastes of distant lands, and the bonds formed in battle lingered in their minds. The significance of their shared meals, those simple feasts that marked their return, would never fade. As they sat at their tables, they would remember the long nights spent around campfires in faraway lands, sharing what little food they had. The spices and the fruits of Persia, the bold flavors of India, and the strange but delicious dishes they had encountered became part of the soldiers' own culinary lexicon. These experiences, woven into the fabric of their identities, had changed the way they saw food, and, perhaps, the way they saw the world. While the Macedonian soldiers returned to the quiet life of their homeland, they carried with them a broader understanding of the world. Food, in all its variety, had become a symbol of the vastness of the lands they had conquered, of the rich cultures they had encountered, and of the diverse people they had fought beside. Their meals, once humble and simple, were now infused with memories of distant empires. Bread and olives might have been the mainstay, but there was also the occasional dish spiced with the flavors of the East or a fruit brought back from Persia. These small, everyday pleasures, the foods they had once craved during their long marches, became a daily reminder of their extraordinary journey. In many ways, their return to normalcy was not just about returning to their homes, but about reintegrating into a world they had changed forever. They had not only reshaped the political landscape of the known world, but had also, in their own way, reshaped the way people viewed food, travel, and cultural exchange. They were living proof that the world was interconnected, that no matter how far one might travel, food would always be the bridge that connected people across vast distances. The Macedonian soldiers and their leader Alexander had spread more than just military might. They had spread a culinary revolution. Looking back, it's easy to see that food in all its forms played a quiet yet central role in Alexander's campaign. It wasn't just the sustenance that kept his men marching. It was the opportunity to taste the world, to try new flavors, and to experience the richness of foreign cultures. Food became a symbol of survival, of camaraderie, and of the triumphs and struggles they shared. In their final return to Macedonia, as they ate their meals of home, the soldiers understood that they had not only conquered lands but had gained something more profound, an understanding of the world and a deeper appreciation for the simple act of breaking bread with others. For Alexander himself, the return to the simplicity of home was not just a physical homecoming, but a personal one as well. He had spent his life conquering and expanding, pushing his limits and challenging the world. But now, back in Macedonia, he could rest. There were no more wars to fight, no more lands to conquer. In the quiet moments, sharing a meal with those who had followed him, perhaps he found the peace he had long sought. And in this final chapter of his journey, it was not the grand victories that defined his legacy but the quieter moments, the shared meals, the shared stories, and the shared humanity that would endure. The Macedonian army's journey, with all its triumphs and tribulations, had been more than just a military campaign. It was a journey of transformation, of understanding the world in all its complexity. And for Alexander and his soldiers, the greatest gift of all might have been the simple realization that, after all the conquests, the greatest treasures they had fought for were not riches or glory, but the chance to return home, to be with loved ones, and to savor the meals that reminded them of what they had truly been fighting for all along.